वेरी वार्म वेलकम टू ऑल ऑफ यू। आपका बहुत स्वागत है। नेहरू डायलॉग्स वायर और मिडलैंड के साथ मिलकर हम आज की यह बातचीत यहाँ आयोजित कर रहे हैं। यह देखना बहुत ही एक तरह से उत्साह की चीज़ है कि दिल्ली के इस प्रदूषण में वक्त के ठीक पहले आप तमाम लोग आ गए। और आते वक्त मैं यह सोच रहा था कि हम जैसे जो कुछ लोग बुज़ुर्ग हो गए हैं, वे नौजवानों के बारे में जब ये कहते रहते हैं कि अब वे कुछ महसूस नहीं करते, ठीक उसी वक्त नौजवान हमको गलत साबित कर देते हैं। तो आप सबका बहुत स्वागत है। आज से तकरीबन 1 साल पहले नेहरू डायलॉग्स की तरफ से ही हमने इसी हॉल में फ़िलिस्तीनी कविताओं के हिंदी तर्जुमे का एक संकलन प्रकाशित किया था। कविता का काम आंसू पोंछना नहीं। उस वक्त गाज़ा पर इजरायली हमले के 2 महीने भी नहीं हुए थे और हम ये सोच रहे थे कि शायद पूरी दुनिया इस हमले के ख़िलाफ़ इस तरह खड़ी होगी कि दिसंबर का महीना गुजरने नहीं पाएगा, लेकिन ऐसा हुआ नहीं। और अब 1 साल बीतने के बाद गाज़ा पर हो रहा हमला पश्चिमी तट, लेबनान और दूसरी जगहों तक फैल गया है। जो कत्ल हुए हैं उनकी तादाद हज़ारों में है और जैसा आप सारे लोग जानते हैं कि जो मारे गए हैं, मार डाले गए हैं, उनमें ज़्यादातर बच्चे और औरतें हैं और बुज़ुर्ग हैं। बल्कि शायद ही किसी ऐसे हिंसा में मारे गए लोगों का प्रतिशत बच्चों का इतना ज़्यादा होगा। और ये भी हमारे वक्त की ही पहचान है कि जो अपने आप को जमहूरी मुल्क कहते हैं, उन्होंने जैसे तय कर लिया है कि जब तक वो गज़ा के एक एक आदमी को न मार डालें, यह हमला किसी भी तरह नहीं रुकना चाहिए। तो यह हमला सिर्फ इज़राइल का नहीं है, एक तरह से इसमें अमेरिका, यूरोप की सरकारें, ये सब हिस्सा ले रही हैं। और जब इसका हिसाब होगा तो उनसे भी हिसाब इसका लिया जाएगा। लेकिन हम आज सारे जो लोग यहाँ इकट्ठा हैं, हम इस मसले पर भी बात करेंगे और दूसरे मसलों पर भी बात करेंगे। आपको जो दावतनामा दिया गया है उसमें सीमा चिश्ती जो सैको से बात करने वाली हैं और उनका परिचय आगे दिया जाएगा। वे कार्टूनिस्ट हैं, पत्रकार हैं, लेखक हैं और यात्री हैं। नेहरू डायलॉग्स के बारे में मैं सिर्फ 1 मिनट में आपको बताना चाहता हूँ कि यह एक अनौपचारिक मंच है और इस मंच का इरादा यह है कि हम नेहरू के विचारों का प्रचार नहीं कर रहे हैं और न नेहरू वादी बनाने की कोई कोशिश कर रहे हैं। हमारा इरादा यह है कि हम अलग अलग मसलों पर एक दूसरे के साथ इख्तलाफात रखते हुए, मतभेद रखते हुए और अलग अलग ढंग से विचार करते हुए एक साथ विचार करने की तमीज़ विकसित कर सकें, जो भारत में अभी गायब हो गई है या जो दुनिया के दूसरे हिस्सों में गायब हो गई है। तो एक तरह से जमहूरियत की तमीज़ पैदा करने की कोशिश, जो बहुत सारी कोशिशें हो रही हैं, उनमें एक कोशिश नेहरू डायलॉग्स है, जिसमें हम टॉक्स करते हैं, किताबों पे डिस्कशन करते हैं, पैनल डिस्कशंस करते हैं। आज की यह बातचीत उसी का एक हिस्सा है। आप सबका एक बार फिर स्वागत है। और जैसा मैंने कहा, हमारे लिए बहुत ही तसल्ली की बात है कि आज इस मौके पर आप इतनी बड़ी तादाद में यहाँ मौजूद हैं और इससे हमारी उम्मीद बनती है कि इंसाफ के लिए लड़ने वालों की तादाद पूरी दुनिया में कभी कम नहीं होगी। तो हम, जैसा हमने कहा कि Nehru Dialogues is a platform where we try or seek to talk about justice in a just way or just manner. This is what we are trying to do. मैं सिद्धार्थ वरदराजन को यहाँ दावत देता हूँ कि वे आएँ और आगे की कार्रवाई बनाएं। सिद्धार्थ वरदराजन, हम जो सैको का नेहरू डायलॉग्स की तरफ से, जवाहर भवन की तरफ से और राजीव गांधी फाउंडेशन की तरफ से बहुत स्वागत करते हैं। सिद्धार्थ।
Thank you, Apoorvanand. Thank you, the Jawahar Bhawan, for giving us the use of this place. When Vighnesh, Simona and others approached me a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks back, with the news that Joe Sacco was in the NCR. He is teaching a course at, or teaching students at Ashoka University. And when Vighnesh and Simona said that he's around and it would be nice if, in addition to whatever he was doing on campus, some kind of a public event could be organized in Delhi that would allow a wider audience to hear from him. I jumped at the opportunity, not just because of my enormous love and respect for his work, but also because I had thought, me and my colleagues had thought, that we could organize an event on a grand scale, a large public event, a ticketed event, which we would use to raise money for the kids of Palestine and Gaza. The UNRWA has had its funding shut off, its access is being denied now, and we felt that every little bit would help. And if you look at the global scale, at the size of protests, at the size of public manifestations of disgust and anger at what's happening, the killing, the war in Gaza, the ongoing genocide, India is one of those countries which, despite its history, despite its very proud tradition of standing with the people of Palestine, standing with victims of war, India has been relatively silent. And this silence, I don't think, is because of a lack of feeling on people's part. This silence is something which has been introduced amidst us by the way in which over the last 10 years, debate, discussion, civic protest has all become so much more difficult than it ever was in the past. We are in a country which calls itself the world's biggest democracy, but where in at least 7 or 8 states, people who have come on the streets to protest the war in Gaza, to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, have found themselves arrested, have found themselves being accused of all kinds of absurd crimes. This is a country where even in the capital city of Delhi, it's virtually impossible to have any kind of public manifestation. The last time that I was able to attend and speak at a Palestine solidarity event was something that was organized at the Press Club, a closed-door event. And it seemed to me that using Joe Sacco's presence amongst us, we could perhaps break with this restriction and have some kind of a public event, ticketed event. And sadly, we hit a brick wall because many of the big venues that The Wire has used in the past to organize events came up with this requirement that, oh, if it's going to be a Gaza solidarity event, if it's going to be a ticketed event for this purpose, then you need police permission. Why in a democracy to have an event in a hall, you need police permission is something that is very difficult to understand. I'm told that this isn't even a legal requirement, but it's something that many venues have willingly taken on upon themselves. And just when it seemed as if it would be impossible to find a venue to have a program of this kind. Apoorvanand, with the Nehru Dialogues platform, and of course the Jawahar Bhawan have made this venue available to us. And despite the fact that at fairly short notice we have pushed for holding this kind of an event, it's not the kind of event that we had hoped. So this is not a fundraiser. This is just an occasion for us to draw a line. And drawing a line means many things, but it also means, apart from the art, the fine art that Joe Sacco has deployed over his career, it also means taking a stand. It also means that as citizens of the world, we say enough's enough. Apoorvanand had spoken about the idea that by December the killing would stop. Another December is approaching. There's no sign of this in sight. But it's important that people in every part of the world, and especially in India and in Delhi, a city and a country that has not registered its voice, that we draw this line. So I am really thrilled at the response that this event has garnered. I see this as a tribute not just to the work and the popularity of Joe Sacco, but also a sign that the causes that he has stood by and the cause that has brought us here today is something that's close to everyone's heart. So thank you very much for being here. We will circulate a kind of a notebook where you can, we'd like it if you could give us your name and your email and phone number so we can be in touch for future events. So if and when we do manage to organize that fundraising event or any other kind of event, we can be in touch. So that's all I wanted to say by way of an introduction. And the way this program will proceed is that Vighnesh from Ashoka, who is the person who brought Joe Sacco to us, will now come on stage and introduce and speak about Joe Sacco and his work, after which there will be an on-stage conversation between Seema Chishti, who is the editor of The Wire, and Joe Sacco. So Vighnesh, over to you. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. Of course, the numbers and the excitement and the solidarity in this room are testaments to the fact that Joe Sacco needs no introduction. So this is less that and more a note of gratitude. That Joe Sacco is one of the world's foremost comic artists and journalist, and in many ways is the creator of war reportage graphic narrative is common knowledge. That he is the composer of the books Palestine, Footnotes in Gaza, Safe Area Gorajda, Paying the Land, among others, in which what we get is equally the horror of the geopolitical and the simpler but no less devastations of life itself, in which the necessity of the historical narrative is always supplemented with counter-histories, oral narratives, memory, experience, feeling, and the everyday is also evident. So I'd like to speak about something else. On January 26, 2024, Joe Sacco began publishing strips of comics periodically in the Comics Journal as a response to the genocide in Gaza and Palestine. In the very first panel that was published, in the second panel, in the first strip that was published, he asks a question. Is it genocide? Is it self-defense? Let's make both sides happy. Let's make everyone happy and say it's both. In that case, we'll need a new term. I propose genocidal self-defense. What this phrase does is that it refuses to debate between the two terms of taking the two sides and refuses to debate between the two terms by taking both of them together. And then, of course, self-defense can no longer be used as a justification for the action, because it's saying, sure, self-defense, but what's the particularity of the self-defense? What is that act through which that self-defense is being taken forward? And then in the visual itself, in the panel itself, you have one bomb per person. And you have an array of people and an array of bombs. And these people are already, in fact, I wish I could show you the picture, in which each person is, in fact, already covered by a cloth, shrouded, dead. And so at once he's capturing the scale of destruction, but suggesting also that in many ways the people on whom these bombs are being dropped have already been killed by history and our apathy, and that this, whatever is being called a war, is actually not at all happening on equal terms, because here people are already in shrouds on which the bomb is being dropped. And so even the title, War on Gaza, is actually trying to battle with the term war by saying it's actually not two equal parties, it's on somebody that the war is being committed. Here Sacco is not just doing the journalism, but also doing commentary. He is speaking not only as a journalist, but as a being in the world living today, when we are being asked to be, and not by no one in particular, a witness, to pay attention and respond. In so doing, and in coining new phrases and scenarios such as this, he's also reorienting the way we understand this issue and the world, pushing against the conventional narratives in which most media and the world speak about it. To this act of reorientation, which is actually an act that streams through all his work, and to the ethic of attention that his work stands for, and the exhortation to pay witness that his work places upon us, I am beholden as I invite Joe and Seema on stage. Thank you.
So very good evening and a very warm welcome, Joe. You were speaking to some farmers in Gurgaon, I gather, and we're so glad that despite pollution and the debilitating traffic, you made it spot on time. Thank you and a very good evening. Welcome to Jawahar Bhawan, Nehru Dialogues, and to The Wire. And we're truly delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you and pick your brains. I think plenty has been said, and all of us here have been watching your work for years, for decades, so you truly do not need an introduction to this room. All I can say is that I just want to thank you for helping us be the lens through which we've been able to witness our times. You've allowed us to bear witness to horror that unfolds around us now and which has happened in the past. So I thought we'll just kick off by, I think you probably would have answered this question several times, but you do comics journalism, you're a cartoonist, you're a war reporter, you're an author, you're a writer. So how do you describe your own work if woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning and asked to do so?
Well, first I'd get pissed off that someone woke me up at 3 a.m. By the way, thank you for coming out, and thank you for the introductions, and I appreciate being here. I describe myself as a cartoonist, and part of the reason I do that is I kind of got into the profession, if you want to call it that, to make people laugh. That's the reason I wanted to do comics, and over time, the comics became obviously more serious and took on a journalistic aspect. But I prefer the word cartoonist because I've always wanted to delve into something other than journalism. It might not be reflected in most of my work, but I need to keep that elbow room. But if I had to describe what most of my work is, it is comics journalism.
Okay, so Joe, I mean, you have a sort of degree in journalism, and then you have this amazing talent. So these two things, the artistic and the journalistic, impulse, which sometimes needs much coarser ways of documenting the times. So how do you bridge the artistic and the journalistic in each of your works? And you're doing this is war reporting, so how do you bridge the two things? And why did you think of melding the two together? Wouldn't it simply be easier to write or photograph or to do video?
Well, I did get a degree in journalism, and I wanted to be a news writer for a newspaper, but I could never find a job doing that. And to make a long story short, after 2 or 3 years of, or more of sort of soul-crushing, semi-journalistic jobs, I just decided to get out of it and fall back on something I'd been doing as a kid, which was cartooning. At some point, I ended up in Berlin doing rock posters and album covers and that kind of thing. But I was still very interested in the world. That's why I got involved in journalism. And I was particularly interested in what was going on in the Middle East and with the Palestinians. And I decided I would do a series of comics about traveling there. So I initially thought of it as travelogue. While I was there, it turned into more of a journalistic project because basically the journalism was in my blood in a way. So without really thinking about it too much, I began asking questions like a journalist, behaving like a journalist. And so the two things, the artistic side of me and the journalistic side of me came together, but there was no theory behind it. I didn't sit back beforehand and say, this is what I'm gonna do, this is why this would make all the sense in the world. I just went and things very organically developed with that book, as I was doing that book and doing the research. Later on, I became more self-conscious. And part of the reason I become self-conscious is because people ask me questions and then I do have to theorize.
I'm really sorry for being
No,
that
that's
person.
okay.
Yeah, but
That's okay.
one more craft question, just sort of as a lot of us here would be reporters trying to make sense of our time. How does somebody like you, what does taking notes mean for you? I mean, do you take pictures? Do you do rough outlines? Do you sketch as you speak? Describe a day at work, please.
Right. I mean, if you saw me in the field, so to speak, I wouldn't look much different from an ordinary journalist. I'd be taking notes and I would be recording conversations, and I take photographs for reference. What I tend not to do is sketch. I only sketch if it's a situation where it might be a bit dangerous to take a picture. You're told not to take a picture, but you're not told you can't draw something, so that's what I do. I tend to take the photographs because I want them for reference. And I tend to prefer just to speak to people and spend my time in that manner. So yeah, my work looks like a regular journalist, except maybe when I'm asking questions, I'm asking visual questions of people. It's not just the typical questions, but it's also questions that will help give me a picture of what a scene looked like.
And you also draw yourself in the pictures. I mean, there's Joe Sacco kind of talking, speaking, wandering in all your books almost, and you have a take on it in your Manifesto Anyone in journalism, that particular book of yours. So could you take us through that, about the process of drawing yourself into it? Because journalists make so much about keeping themselves out of the story, conversely also pushing themselves too much into the story. But how does Joe, the illustrator, cartoonist, jump into the panels?
Well, again, that was something that sort of developed accidentally without too much thinking about it. At that time, I came out of a tradition, a North American tradition of doing autobiographical comics. So when I went to the Middle East, when I went to the Palestinian territories, again, with really not really understanding what I was doing, in a sense, it just seemed this was carrying over my autobiographical work. So it would be my experiences in Gaza or in the West Bank. And over time, so I was just a figure in my comics, but over time I realized the journalistic advantages of it, especially in that having my figure in the panels sort of signals the reader that you're seeing this through the eyes of one journalist. I'm not some demigod authority about a subject. I'm a living, breathing human being who is interacting with people and is subject to the forces of conversations and just the things that are going on around you. And I want people to understand sort of the seams of journalism, the seams of getting things done in contexts like that. Because to me it was always mystifying, even when I was studying it. So it sort of works to my advantage. The other thing I think is it made me realize that I don't really believe what I was taught about objective style journalism. I sort of jettisoned that, and having my figure in the comic books suggests that. This is a subjective experience that's happening here.
So a little more on subjective, what you say about objective or so-called neutral, which is even a worse word than objective, but there is what's also called balance in journalism, about both sides and doing some kind of arithmetic mean, and that's where the truth will lie. So what are the dangers with that kind of conception of journalism today that we see a lot of, like some of the worst journalism being held up as correct and accurate because it's balanced and it gets the both-sideism?
Well, I mean, this almost speaks to what the introductions were about the Palestinians. I grew up thinking Palestinians were terrorists. So that wasn't because I was studying the issue or I had a fight. I mean, I had a dog in that fight. It was sort of through as osmosis, without paying particular attention to the issue when I was in high school. What I was hearing on TV, what I was reading in the newspapers, every time the word Palestinian was mentioned, it was also in conjunction with the word terrorism. So it was Palestinians have hijacked a bus, Palestinians have hijacked a plane, the Palestinians are firing rockets. All these objectively true facts, but the other objectively true facts were never really filled in. You didn't find out what Israel was doing, and certainly you didn't understand the history of why things were happening the way they were happening. You never got the context. And in the early 80s, when Israel invaded Lebanon, their army moved up to Beirut, and in one incident they surrounded a Palestinian refugee camp, Sabra Shatila, and their Lebanese allies, Christian allies, went into the camp and killed hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian civilians in cold blood. And I remember seeing the photographs in Time magazine and thinking, but I thought the Palestinians were the terrorists. So something just snapped a bit. And of course I was upset by that, but I already had a degree in journalism. And I thought, well, the gold standard American journalism that I was taught actually pulled the wool over my eyes. And sort of a resentment developed that I was led into this pit of misinformation. And I sort of made it my task to sort of learn about it. And there wasn't much to read about it at that time. And to find out what Palestinians had to say. So to me, I never really feel that I have to balance this with an Israeli point of view, because the truth of the matter is, especially if you grow up in the West, the Israeli point of view is all you hear. I mean, it's always a battle of narratives, and in those days, there was not even a Palestinian narrative. I mean, from an American point of view.
So conflict seems to have kind of attracted, you've done lots of stuff on Rolling Stones, which I haven't seen, that's my loss, and all these rock bands, and you designed these album covers, which you must speak about. You have like a very wide overview. But conflict kind of drew you from the very start. Did that speak to you about your time as a younger person in Malta and your earliest cartoons? And I think you've also sketched something on your mother's reminiscences and her recollections of the Second World War. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, I grew up in Australia, really. I mean, I was born in Malta, but I was a baby when we left for Australia. And Australia was sort of full of people who had immigrated from Europe, from all the countries of Europe after the Second World War. And so the talk of people my parents' age was about the war. When people came over from Poland or Germany or the Ukraine or wherever it was, you heard stories of the war. That was the commonality. And my parents had certainly endured a lot in the war. Malta was, at that point, was the most heavily bombed place on Earth. It's a small island, it was a British base, and the Germans and the Italians bombed it for 2.5 years, and it was under starvation conditions. So I heard a lot of those things, and the idea that war can be present in your life was never really far from my mind. It made me interested especially in how civilians react in those conditions. And one of my early comics, as you mentioned, was about my mother's experiences in the war. And she was a a young girl, 14, who got a scholarship to go to the city of Valletta from her village, and the war was going on, and if she didn't go, she would lose her scholarship. So no matter what happened on the way, including being personally attacked by a German fighter plane, she never told her mother, because her mother would hold her back. So, I mean, those kind of stories are what I grew up with, and I developed some feeling for what people have to endure.
Just coming to your absolutely fabulous work, I mean, all of it is, but you know, Palestine and footnotes in Gaza is something that really now speaking and sitting here in 2024 just comes back at us really powerfully. You speak of how, I mean, a very important part of your work is to speak to people and, you know, your illustrations giving real people faces, and you kind of sit through their so-called boring, drab lives, sad lives, the tentativeness of it, the uncertainty, and you try and lock it in time by giving us a narrative and putting it out there rather than just being something which is a continuum which is accepted. But you have this very interesting take, you and I think it was Chris Hedges with whom you did some work, and you spoke of how the people of Palestine themselves were not that much interested in the 1956 massacres in Rafah and Khan Yunus that you were trying to talk about. So tell us about how, when you spoke to the people there, they wanted you to concentrate on the here and now in the 90s. I think you spent 2 months in the 1991 winter there. And you were trying to get them to focus on 1956 and how that became, and why do people do that? Even people who know that that has a bearing on their todays, but they were indifferent to that. So,
yeah, I did a book called Footnotes on Gaza about 1956 and the massacres in Khan Yunus and Rafah. And my idea was to go and speak to older people about what happened in 56. Often in these situations, their sons and their grandsons are sitting in on the conversations, and sometimes the younger people would look at me and say, "Why are you talking about this historical event? Can't you see what's happening? 200 meters from here, the Israeli army is bulldozing houses in rows." So I understood why they were saying those things, but what it shows to me in a way is that. As someone once told me, events are continuous. It's not like this event happened in 56, and that's something everyone can sort of digest and reflect on. There is no time for Palestinians to digest a thing, because something always is coming at them. So why would they talk about 56? It might seem strange to them. Why would they talk about 56 now? But I can tell you why. Because Chris Hedges and I met a guy named El Rantisi, who was one of the founders of Hamas. And his uncle, when El Rantisi was 8 years old, his uncle was taken out by Israeli soldiers, lined up against a wall and shot. And El Rantisi said, at that moment, hatred entered our hearts. So that's why history is important. If you want to understand context.
So, I mean, I just want to talk about something that Vighnesh mentioned as we come to discuss some of the bearing of Gaza on today and the world outside Gaza. And he said that how you had said that, okay, fine, it's a genocide and it's self-defense, so let's call it genocidal self-defense. But do you think there's a reconciliation possible in the way the whole information world works on these two completely diverse worldviews on self-defense and genocide?
I don't think so. I mean, I think self-defense is something we understand, but if the term can mean anything, from stopping someone at the border from coming and doing you harm to annihilating a whole people, then the term becomes kind of meaningless in my own mind. I mean, if we're going to keep talking about self-defense, let's try to define what that means. I'm not saying I have an answer for that, but I think it's a real mistake just to assume that everything can be covered under self-defense and that self-defense justifies everything and anything.
So, Joe, as we speak, I think the latest number of journalists killed in Gaza is about 137. So, of course, there is great destruction of children, a whole people, women, young men, etc. But just focusing for a minute on what has happened with the killing of journalists and targeted killing of people who will live to tell the story. What bearing does that have on journalists outside Gaza, on the whole business of bearing witness and documenting stuff? Is this like a moment?
Well, I think any journalist who really cares about journalism understands that this is kind of a morbid and special moment. I don't think there's ever been a time when journalists have been targeted like this and have had to work under such horrifying conditions. It's not just about, I mean, journalists in war, there's personal safety issues, but it's different when you're targeted, and I think it's more different, it's even worse when your children, your wives, your husbands are targeted. That takes it into another realm. And you know, my hat is off to those journalists that they're sticking by it. To them, journalism is a vocation. It's not just about sitting in front of a camera and reading something that's handed to them that, you know, just to read out to an audience. So I'm sort of stunned by their bravery and their fortitude, but they should not have to they shouldn't be going through that sort of thing.
Yeah. So do you think it was easier to kill journalists in Gaza because they were Palestinians and they didn't allow your CNN there, the BBCs there, or others in the world? Was that like part of a thought-through idea that you could just kill Gazan journalists and get away with it?
I think it seems to be possible to kill anyone if they're Palestinian. Journalists are a subset, but they're also killing medical personnel. They're killing people trying to clear rubble. They're killing people in safe zones. As a journalist, it really strikes me that this is happening. And of course, as journalists, we have to raise our voice about that. We're getting into a world where certain things that seem to be clear, and now it's like the rug is being pulled from under our feet. Everything is possible now.
So with this kind of larger basic principles, if you like, very elemental, I'm not even talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but just basic principles being under question, do you see a ray of light? Is there any hope for the whole business of telling stories, of being able to state it, and especially at a time when there is so much, so much technology threatens the whole idea of telling stories in a humane way, and the politics in the world going the way it's gone?
Is there any hope? I'm not sure I would use the word hope. I think when you see the bravery of some of the people, you realize what humans are still capable of. And I hate to use the word inspiration, because it's not like it's inspirational. It's beyond, it sort of goes beyond the realms of what we're used to. But I see them working, and it makes it, whatever troubles I might have with my work, whatever, thumb might come down on any one of us, it's nothing like that.
Just the fact that it gives us context on what the real dangers are and how brave they've been.
Yeah, that's right.
But at a time like you have Mr. Trump now coming out with what the rules should be, the rules of, he's put out some 9 points on Truth Social. You have the richest man in the world is also running X. And, all kinds of information and disinformation is being put out. It's targeted. It's to people. This great marriage of technology, great power, and, just completely strange idea about wiping out the narrative from the left and telling the truth. Where do you see the business of real truth-telling, speaking, documenting our times? How do you speak to that challenge?
Well, there's certainly a great amount of misinformation at this point. I think the mainstream over time, I can talk about the West. It's hard for me to talk about the Indian context. But in the West, the mainstream seems to have really discredited itself. It's bought into so many things. It's told us so many lies. You're seeing this especially with the story of what's going on in Gaza and the Middle East. We're getting, narratives are being crushed. I think we're heading in that direction now, where it's really up to individuals who think of journalism as something that's, as if you're a Jesuit priest. It's a vocation, it's a calling. You have to think of it in those terms. And people, the amount of misinformation, we're going to be swamped by it. That's just the way it is. But we have to keep, I think we have to keep the idea of what real journalism is, what we have to try to get as close to the truth as we can, whatever problems that entails. There are those among us that just have to keep doing that and pressing that, you know, despite the consequences.
Okay, so that's like really nice. I'd like to also throw open the questions to the audience, but a little bit about your work in India. I think relatively few people know about your visits and your detailed stories from Kushinagar in Uttar Pradesh. And I think you were also working on a communal riot in India. I don't know if that book got out. It did.
No,
you're
it's out in
working.
France. It's out in French. If you can read French, you can order it.
Alas, I can't. But yeah, but your pictures are so gripping that I would. But tell us something about what working in India feels like. And when you were in Kushinagar in 2011, was it?
Or I can't remember
Early,
exactly, to tell you the truth. Something like that.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting story. It was about Dalits in Kushinagar, and it was about the schemes that are meant to help the Dalits and how those end up in reality. The story in Uttar Pradesh, the book, is about Muzaffarnagar and the riot that took place there. And it initially started out as, I'm interested in narrative and how they're shaped. So I went there about a year after the riot, or the riots, and I wanted to find out what people would tell themselves about what they did a year later. So that's the basic thrust of that. And as I was doing that, I realized there were other themes, and one of them must seem obvious to you in India, but it's becoming more obvious to us in the West, and particularly in America, is the role of violence in electoral politics. That's the other part of it. It's sort of an examination of that.
But any idea when the English edition of this?
The wheels of production sometimes move slowly, but there'll be a English language edition about 10 months from now.
Okay, super. So I think I'll just throw open the floor for audience questions. Siddharth, we can take some questions, right? But before that, I just want to read from Edward Said's foreword to Joe Sacco's Palestine, and it's truly striking because that's what Joe's work does, and despite this may cause him embarrassment, but I'm going to read from here. Nowhere does Sacco come closer to the existential lived reality of the average Palestinian than in his depiction of life in Gaza, the national inferno. The vacancy of time, the drabness, not to say sordidness of everyday life in the refugee camps, the network of relief workers, bereaved mothers, unemployed young men, teachers, police, hangers-on, the ubiquitous tea or coffee circle, the sense of confinement, permanent muddiness and ugliness conveyed by the refugee camp, which is so iconic to the whole Palestinian experience, these are rendered with almost terrifying accuracy and, paradoxically enough, gentleness at the same time. Joe, the character, is there sympathetically to understand and to try to experience not only why Gaza is so representative a place in its hopelessly overcrowded and yet rootless spaces of Palestinian dispossession, but also to affirm that it is there and must somehow be accounted for in human terms in the narrative sequences with which any reader can identify. And I think coming from Edward's side, that's really rich praise. And it's a long forward, so Syed has taken his time.
Good evening. I am Basim from Palestinian Embassy. Exactly, I am native from Gaza. Just I want to thank you, Joe Sacco, about the presentation, and Seema. And thank you to all Indian people about concerning and solidarity and support Palestinian people. Thank you very much, thank you very much, thank you. And thank you to organizer and to invitation.
So I don't think we could have had a better closing than that. Sorry. And I request Apoorvanand to give his vote of thanks. Could you please also do it in English?
Yeah.
Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया. Thanks. Shukriya can also be said in English. So, shukriya Seema, shukriya Joe Sacco, and shukriya to all of you who ask questions, and then we know that questions can be solved. that long. Thank you, all of you. Don't forget Palestine. Don't forget Palestinian people. They need all of you to remember them. And as Joe said, then don't let it become normal. It's stuck in our throat, let it remain like that. Don't let it become normal. Thank you very much. बहुत शुक्रिया जवाहर भवन, नामिक, माधव, अनुज, सारे लोग, सबसे ज़्यादा विजय महाजन जी, हमें यह मौका देने के लिए. Thank you very much, Wire, and also Midland Books, and Vighnesh for making it possible, and all of you who came here. Thank you very much.